Late February 1991. It all begins in darkness and silence. But this is not a peaceful quiet. It is the cold, digital void of a dead network. Deep beneath Krasnograd, in a fortified bunker where the Eurasian Federation was living out its final months, the air, thick with stale tobacco smoke, was pierced by the metallic taste of a new, unknown fear. General Mikhail Moiseyev, chief of the Soviet General Staff, his face as if carved from granite, stared intently at a map that was turning into a meaningless piece of paper before his eyes. For weeks, he and his analysts had monitored the US-led coalition's air campaign against their satellite state, the Republic of Sarkhan. They had watched with a professional, even arrogant detachment. Soviet doctrine, imprinted upon the minds of the Sarkhan Republican Guard, was designed to withstand such an onslaught. Air power, they taught, was a surgeon's scalpel, not a reaper's scythe. It could harass and delay, but it could never destroy a prepared, dug-in army. The real war, the ground war, promised to be a bloodbath. The Americans, with their untested, all-volunteer army, were expected to get hopelessly bogged down. The Soviet T-72 tanks, BMP infantry fighting vehicles, and layered air defense network were supposed to inflict a bloody toll the Atlantic Alliance could not afford to pay. That was the theory. That was the consensus. On February 24, 1991, that theory turned to dust. The first reports were dismissed as the, quote, "2", the next as panic, the last as blatant, insane lies. The ground operation, codenamed, quote, "3", was supposed to last for weeks. It was over in 100 hours. And therein lay the mystery. Not a single incredible event, but 100 hours of a continuous, cascading nightmare. The teletypes in Moiseyev's bunker tapped out a feverish rhythm as dispatches from GRU agents in the region painted a picture not of a battle, but of an annihilation. Entire divisions of the Sarkhan army, once the fourth most powerful in the world, were not merely being defeated, they were being wiped from the face of the earth. An intercept from a signals intelligence post on the Onyx Sea became a legend within the walls of the GRU. On the airwaves, a panicked Sarkhan Corps commander was screaming to Sarkhangrad. His voice, distorted by static, cracked with terror. He yelled that his columns of T-72 tanks were engulfed in flames. Not under attack, not in combat with the enemy. They were simply burning. He reported that the sky was humming with an unbearable alien sound, that his men were fleeing, driven mad by fear. He begged for orders. There was no reply. His transmission was cut short by a sound unlike any explosion. It was a piercing, ear-splitting electronic screech. And then, only the hiss of dead air. The Soviet General Staff was a collection of cold pragmatists. They were masters of logistics, numbers, and the scientific theory of war. And the numbers laid on their desks made no sense. They simply didn't add up. The Americans, as Soviet intelligence reported, had launched their, quote, "6", a massive flanking maneuver deep into the desert. This was a classic Soviet 7 operation. The Sarkhanis should have seen it coming. Their radars, their patrols, their own Eurasian Federation-supplied reconnaissance units, all of them were silent. The American 7th Corps and 18th Airborne Corps, hundreds of thousands of soldiers and thousands of armored vehicles, covered hundreds of kilometers of barren desert and simply materialized on the Sarkhan flank, like a phantom army emerging from a sandstorm. How? How did they move with such speed? How did they coordinate their actions in the featureless, empty desert at night in a storm? Soviet doctrine, for all its power, was a cumbersome, top-down machine. It required maps, timetables, and fixed lines. The Americans, however, operated with a flexibility and speed that seemed to defy the very laws of military science. But the reports from the air were even more terrifying. The formidable Sarkin air defense system, a dense network of Soviet S-6 and S-8 missile complexes integrated with French systems, an architecture Soviet advisors had helped build, had been blinded. It simply stopped seeing. The air defense system they had helped design was not merely suppressed, it was blinded, methodically hunted down and torn to shreds. In the first nights of the air war, Sarkin pilots taking off in advanced MiG-29s reported ghostly signatures on their radars. One moment, an American F-15 was diving for an attack. The next, the radar would simply go dark. A click, and then nothing. Their screens were flooded with the white noise of jamming, and moments later, a missile they never saw coming would turn their aircraft into a fireball. This wasn't war. It was electronic sorcery. For the men within the walls of the Krasnograd bunker, this was not just a military analysis. It was a verdict. The real chilling horror, the central mystery that made the blood run cold in the veins of the Soviet general staff, was not the defeat of an ally. It lay in the method. The realization struck like a blow. The entire Soviet military-industrial complex, a gargantuan machine that had consumed a quarter of the country's GDP for 5 decades, had built an army perfectly suited to fight the last war. The Americans, it seemed, were already fighting the next one. The hardware now burning in the Sarkin Desert was the same that stood guard on the borders of the Volgograd Pact. The T-72 tank was the backbone of the Red Army. The BMP infantry fighting vehicle was its unbreakable iron chariot. The doctrine of a massive armored thrust under the cover of layered air defenses was not just a strategy, it was a state religion. And the Americans had just staged a public execution of its god. Analysts in Krasnograd paced like caged animals, desperately searching for an explanation. A secret weapon? A new type of death ray? An energy cannon? Reports from panicked Sarkin soldiers were steeped in primal terror. They whispered of angels of death descending from the night's darkness. They spoke of invisible tanks that struck them from miles away, long before Sarkin gunners could spot a target in their sights. They passed along rumors of cluster bombs that unleashed a steel rain from a clear sky, smart munitions that hunted their armor, seeking the heat of running engines. But the most potent, most chilling symbol of this new, unthinkable warfare was yet to come. As the rout began, tens of thousands of retreating Sarkin soldiers flooded north out of Al-Kharif along the 6-lane Highway 101. It was the death agony of a disorganized, panic-stricken mass, a chaotic mix of stolen civilian cars, buses, and the elite armored vehicles of the Republican Guard. They were trapped. They were defenseless, and they were about to become guinea pigs in a gruesome experiment. For 10 straight hours, under the cover of night, American air power unleashed its might upon this column. Not with the brute force of carpet bombing, but with cold, industrial precision. This was not a battle. It was a harvest. When the sun rose over the desert on February 27th, the first satellite images began to arrive in Krasnograd. The analysts at GRU headquarters could not believe their eyes. The images did not show a highway. They showed a graveyard. 2,000 vehicles, frozen bumper to bumper in a final traffic jam, burned to their frames. Tanks with their turrets blown off like the lids of tin cans. Trucks melted into the asphalt. In the world's media, the sight was dubbed the quote, 19. For the men in Krasnograd, it was something far more terrifying. It was a message, a demonstration of power. The mystery was no longer whether the Americans could fight. The question was, what diabolical system allowed them to see everything, strike any target, and kill at will, while remaining completely invulnerable? The Cold War, they suddenly realized, had not been a stalemate. It was checkmate, delivered on a board they never even knew existed. And the hunt for the secret of this unstoppable machine, this new god of war, had just become the most desperate investigation in the history of Soviet intelligence. The quote, 21 was not just a military catastrophe. It became a symbol of an intellectual vacuum, a problem for which the Soviet General Staff had no formula. In the weeks that followed the 100-hour war, the immense machinery of Kremlin intelligence and military science roared to life, launching a frantic, desperate investigation. A frantic, desperate investigation began. It was an autopsy not just of the Sarkin army, but of their own. The first reaction was denial, furious accusations. In closed-door meetings of the Stavka and the General Staff, the initial reports were torn to shreds. The marshals, men whose careers were built on the cold arithmetic of tank columns and artillery barrages, angrily pointed the finger at their client. The Sarkanis were undisciplined, poorly trained, tactically inept. They had failed, utterly failed, to apply the Soviet doctrine of deep battle. A wave of orders cascaded down the chain of command. GRU and KGB residencies across the southern territories and the western continent were given a single, top-priority task: acquire any scrap of data related to the American operation. Quote, interrogate every surviving Sarkin commander, bribe any coalition official, steal any shred of technical specification. Simultaneously, in Krasnograd, the Soviet military advisors who had been attached to Sarkin units, those who had fled with the shattered remnants of the army, were brought to secure countryside dachas. They were not treated as guests. They were debriefed. These debriefings were a mixture of futility and chilling horror. The Soviet officers, many of them veterans of the Kazakhstan conflict, were in a state of shock. They described a war that followed no rules. They spoke haltingly of the American Apache attack helicopters. A Soviet colonel, a tank ace, recounted this in a cracking voice, his hands trembling slightly. His battalion of the latest T-72s, perfectly dug into a defensive berm, had been picked off one by one. Quote, he said hollowly. The Americans, the colonel insisted, were firing from a range of 4, maybe even 5 kilometers. This was unthinkable. The effective range of a T-72's main gun was 2,000 meters, perhaps 3,000 with an AT-11 Sfera missile. But the Americans weren't firing tank shells. They were firing missiles. Missiles that seemed to find their own targets. Missiles that struck from above, penetrating the thinnest top armor of the T-72. His Sarkan crews, he said, never even knew what hit them. They would be scanning an empty, dead desert through their thermal sights, and the next second, their tank's turret would be ripped off and thrown into the air. Thus, the first phantom was born, an invisible helicopter dealing death from beyond the horizon. The pilot stories were even more blood-curdling. The few Sarkan aces who survived encounters with the USAF's F-15 Eagles spoke incoherently, on the verge of hysteria. They described a wall of impenetrable electronic noise. They would take off, their powerful MiG-29 radars scanning the sky. Nothing. Their ground-based guidance radars, the eyes of the entire air defense system, were also blind. And in the next instant, warning sirens would shriek in the cockpit. The wail of a missile lock would scream in their headsets. But from where? Nothing on the radar, nothing visually. The sky was pristine. One Sarkin pilot, trained in the Eurasian Federation, broke down during his GRU debriefing. "It was like fighting a ghost," he forced out. "I was in my MiG-29, the best you gave us. I felt like a god. And then my screen, it just went blank, turned to white, a screen full of snow. The radar warning receiver was screaming that an eagle had me locked. I looked up, left, right, nothing. And then I saw the missile trail, but it wasn't coming at me. It was going away from me. It was my wingman. He just exploded, without a word on the radio. I dove, I ran. I didn't fight, I just ran." This story, and hundreds like it, gave birth to a new, chilling legend. In the quiet of technical bureaus, scientists and engineers pored over satellite images of the Highway of Tears. They analyzed fragments of American munitions that special forces teams at great risk had secretly recovered from the battlefield after the ceasefire. Their first conclusion struck like a thunderclap. The Americans had achieved total, absolute information superiority. It was a terrifying alien concept. Soviet doctrine was a rigid hierarchy, a pyramid. Orders flowed from the top down. The American way, they realized with horror, was a network. As it would later turn out, this wasn't an army, it was a network. Every soldier, every tank, every pilot, and every satellite in orbit was merely a neuron in one giant, all-seeing mind. In desperation, Soviet analysts began to formulate theories, each more fantastic than the last. Theory 1. The Ghost Bomber. Grainy images of the American F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter were already gathering dust in GRU archives. But the scale of destruction rained down upon the Republic of Sarkan's command bunkers suggested something far greater. A hypothesis emerged of a new, stealthy, strategic bomber, perhaps the mythical Aurora project. They imagined a craft capable of loitering for hours over Sarkangrad itself, invisible and invulnerable to radar, coolly dropping laser-guided bombs. Obsessed with finding something tangible, they were searching for a thing, while missing the system. Theory 2. The Devil's Weapon. The reports of dead white radar screens and phantom signals led KGB technical specialists to a chilling conclusion. The Americans had deployed a new, satanic form of electronic warfare. Not just jamming, but active, aggressive intrusion. The theory arose that their EA-6B Prowler and EF-111 Raven aircraft were not just blinding Soviet-made radars, but were hacking them in real time. The idea was so monstrous it bordered on science fiction. That the Americans could inject false targets into the system, erase real ones, and even issue fake commands to missile batteries. But it was the only logical explanation for how the densest, most layered air defense system could be instantly deafened and blinded. Theory 3. The Space-Based Death Ray. This was the most paranoid and top-secret hypothesis of all. In a feverish agony to explain the rows of incinerated tanks, some high-ranking analysts in the strategic rocket forces began to ask a terrifying question. What if the Strategic Defense Initiative, the famous, quote, was just a cover? What if it wasn't a defensive shield, but an offensive space-based platform. Were the Americans using particle beams or high-powered lasers from orbit? Perhaps the angels of death weren't helicopters at all, but beams of pure energy striking from the heavens. Pragmatists quickly dismissed this theory, but the very fact it was discussed in top-secret memoranda reveals the depth of their desperation, their near-primal terror. The search had reached a dead end, breeding myths instead of answers. The marshals in Krasnograd demanded a simple solution. They yearned for a schematic to copy, a technology to steal, a countermeasure to develop. They wanted to build a better radar, a faster missile, a tank with thicker armor. But the charred husks on the quote 43 screamed a far more terrible truth. The problem wasn't the quality of Soviet hardware. The problem was the philosophy behind it. The Americans had created a system in which the perfection of any single component no longer mattered. The F-15 fighter was 30 years old. The B-52 bomber was nearly 50. But in 1991, plugged into this new, incredible network, these veterans were transformed into the weapons of gods. And the most impossible of these technologies, the one that made the entire ground war a reality, wasn't a weapon at all. The Soviets had no name for it. They had no counter for it. They didn't even know it existed. It was a faint, yet scalpel-precise signal, broadcast from a constellation of satellites. A signal that told every American tank, every soldier, and every bomb its exact position on the planet, with an accuracy of 1 meter. The Soviets were masters of the map and compass. The Americans, it turned out, had invented a new god, the god of location. And this new god whispered to them exactly where every T-72 tank was sitting, even in total darkness, even in a howling sandstorm. The investigation failed because the investigators were asking the wrong questions. They were hunting a single phantom when they needed to see the entire invisible architecture of the new American way of war. While the marshals in Krasnograd peered at grainy satellite photos, hunting for ghosts, they were looking in the wrong place. The answer was not a secret stealth plane or a new beam weapon. It was hiding in plain sight, in a series of logical, sequential, and ultimately revolutionary ideas that American minds had been nurturing in quiet think tanks and secret design bureaus for over 20 years. The U.S. military that entered the Azure Gulf in 1991 was a shadow of the one that had shamefully departed the Sarin War in 1973. The ghost of that humiliating defeat, the stranglehold of the OPEC oil embargo, and the realization of the Volgograd Pact's overwhelming numerical superiority had forced a ruthless re-evaluation. America had realized a bitter truth. It could never again afford a war of attrition. To go head-to-head with the Eurasian Federation, tank for tank and soldier for soldier, was to court certain defeat. So they decided not to play by the enemy's rules. They decided to rewrite them. They chose to win the war for information. The solution America found was not a single wonder weapon. It was an ecosystem of technologies designed for 3 purposes: to see everything, to blind the enemy, and to transmit information at the speed of thought. This revolution began not in the scorching desert sands, but in the sterile quiet of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the famed DARPA. In the 1970s, while Soviet designers were welding ever thicker plates of armor onto their T-72s, American engineers were grappling with a far more elegant and complex problem: synchronization. How do you make an army of thousands move with the grace and precision of a single organism? The answer was born under a name that would change the world: the Global Positioning System, or GPS. The very concept sounded like science fiction. The plan was to launch a constellation of 24 satellites into orbit, turning the sky into a web of ultra-precise atomic clocks. Their sole mission, to continuously broadcast a perfect, nanosecond-accurate time signal to the Earth below. For the common American soldier, it was nothing short of a miracle. For the first time in human history, a tank commander, a pilot, or a Marine could look at a small screen and, in any weather, at any time of day, know their position on the planet to within a few feet. The Soviets, peerless masters of the map and compass, had perfected warfare in 2 dimensions. The Americans had just hacked the 4th dimension, time. This quiet, invisible technology became the steel spine of the famed left hook. While Soviet analysts plotted routes on maps, assuming the need for landmarks and massive supply depots, the reality was far more elegant. The tanks of 7th Corps were not wandering through a featureless desert. They were guided to their objective by an invisible pulse from space. They raced at full speed through the night and blinding sandstorms, always knowing exactly where they were, where their comrades were, and where the enemy was. An enemy that was disoriented, blind, and utterly lost. It was this system that allowed an entire airborne corps to literally leapfrog over a Republican Guard division. It was what gave artillery the ability to strike and instantly reposition with surgical accuracy, without risking friendly fire. It was the god of navigation, and it made the 100-hour ground war a reality. But knowing your own location is only half the battle. You have to know where the enemy is, and though Soviet intelligence had an inkling of a new stealth bomber, they had understood only a fraction of the truth. The F-117 Nighthawk, given the ominous code name Gravedigger by the GRU, was not a bomber in the conventional sense. It was a scalpel. A silver bullet designed for a single shot, straight into the enemy's brain. Born in Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works in Boulder, Colorado, the F-117 was less an airplane and more a flying collection of faceted, radar-absorbent panels. Its angular, alien shape was a triumph of computer modeling and physics over the laws of aerodynamics. It was unstable, difficult to fly, and only capable of subsonic speeds. But it could do something no other aircraft on the planet could. It could vanish. It could become a ghost in the sky. It was a ghost plane. On the first night of Operation Desert Storm, 36 F-117s took to the skies. Their mission was not to smash tank columns or crater airfields. No. Their targets were the heart of the Sarkin air defenses, its command bunkers, its central radars, its communications nodes, the entire nervous system of the enemy's defense. And as Soviet military advisors in Sarkingrad cowered in their bunkers, the F-117 pilots circled with impunity over the most heavily defended city on the planet, coolly and methodically carving up its defensive network. 2,000-pound bombs, guided with laser precision, plunged directly into the ventilation shafts of Saddam's headquarters, striking the beast in its lair. They literally vaporized the operations centers that linked together hundreds of Soviet S-6 and S-8 missile batteries. Imagine a Sarkin radar operator desperately staring at his blank screen. Then a voice on the radio informs him that Central Command no longer exists, that in its place is a smoking crater. In that instant, their entire vaunted, impenetrable defense system simply crumbled to dust. The F-117 didn't fight the air defense system. It quietly assassinated it in its sleep. It kicked the door off its hinges so that the others, the F-15s, F-16s, and mighty B-52s, could storm in and finish the job. Yes, this explained the blinded pilots and the deathly silent radars. But it did not explain the, quote, it did not explain the fields littered with burned-out Sarkin tanks. To understand that, one had to add the final, most revolutionary piece to the puzzle. It looked like a clumsy, almost civilian aircraft, a modified Boeing 707 with a massive 30-foot strapped to its fuselage. It carried no guns, no missiles, no bombs. And yet, the E-8 Joint Stars was perhaps the most formidable weapon in the U.S. arsenal. A weapon that never fired a single shot. Behind that dry, almost bureaucratic name, Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar System, hid a truly terrifying power. Inside that, quote, was a phased array radar so powerful it could scan an area of 20,000 square miles, the size of a small country, and track every single moving vehicle within it. It was the all-seeing eye of God, hovering in the heavens. And while the F-117s were killing the Sarkin Army's brain and the GPS satellites were serving as its navigation system, Joint Stars was its eyes. From a safe orbit, hundreds of miles from the front lines, operators inside the E-8 could see, in real time, a Sarkin battalion of T-72 tanks starting their engines. They could see a supply column trying to reach the front. They could see the panicked exodus forming on Highway 101. But Joint Stars was not just an eye. It was a nerve center. It was the network itself. J-Stars operators would detect moving Sarkin tanks. In that same instant, their coordinates would be sent via a secure data link, not by a slow, halting voice on the radio, but as a pure digital pulse to other members of this deadly hunt. The first was the E-3 AWACS, the Airborne Warning and Control System. The AWACS, the conductor of the air battle, would instantly assess the F-15E Strike Eagles under its command, select the one with the perfect attack angle and the right munitions, and digitally assign it the target. The F-15E pilot no longer had to hunt for his prey. He didn't need to scan the ground. He would simply see a new icon flash on his tactical map, a target, already identified, verified, and approved for destruction. But the second platform, the one that struck primal terror into Sarkin tankers, was the AH-64 Apache attack helicopter. The Apache was born to kill tanks, but its true power lay in its TADS system, the ominous orb under its, quote, 63 that combined a powerful thermal imager and a laser designator. And this is where the magic happened. The very impossibility that had broken the Soviet colonel's mind. The J-Stars, 50 miles away, spots a T-72 tank. It instantly transmits its coordinates to an Apache lurking 5 miles from the target, hiding behind a sand dune. The Apache crew never even sees the tank with their own eyes. They don't need to. They simply, they're TADS to the incoming coordinates. A green square, the target's heat signature, flashes on their display. The gunner presses a button. A Hellfire missile leaps from its rail. This angel of death was a fire-and-forget weapon. Fire and forget in action. The missile would climb into the sky, only to plunge down like a stone, piercing the thinnest top armor of the T-72 tank. The Apache would already be melting back into the desert haze, as secondary explosions were still ripping through the Sarkin vehicle. This wasn't just technology. It was an ecosystem, the nervous system of war. American ingenuity made manifest. A GPS satellite talking to a J-Stars, which talked to an AWACS, which talked to an Apache, which talked to a Hellfire missile. The quote was not a battle. It was its logical, systematic, and inevitable consequence. The J-stars spotted the column forming. The AWACS conducted the airspace. And then, for 10 endless hours, A-10 Warthog attack planes, F-15E Strike Eagle fighters, and F-A-18 Hornets received a continuous stream of targets, as if on a conveyor belt of death. It was a harvest made possible by absolute, total, terrifying information superiority. The Soviets had built the world's best spear. The Americans had built the central nervous system that guided it. In Krasnograd, the shock did not arrive in a sudden flash of insight. It did not come with a high-level defector clutching a briefcase of blueprints. It seeped in slowly, like a poison, causing a gradual intellectual collapse as the GRU and Soviet scientific institutes painstakingly pieced together the mosaic of their own obsolescence. The confrontation had not been a battle. It was an audit. In the summer of 1991, months after the war, and just months before the Eurasian Federation itself would cease to exist, a final, top-secret verdict landed on the desk of Defense Minister Marshal Dmitry Yazov. This was not a heated, rambling report from the battlefield. It was a cold, consolidated analysis from NII-4, the fourth scientific research institute of the Ministry of Defense, an organization whose purpose was to dissect foreign military technologies. The report was a revelation. The moment when the ghost in the machine was finally given a name, or rather, a list of names. And the first, most devastating conclusion was that the Eurasian Federation had fundamentally misinterpreted the American Strategic Defense Initiative, the famous Star Wars. With chilling certainty, the analysts declared that the real, operational Star Wars was not some fantasy of space lasers shooting down nuclear missiles. The real Star Wars was the GPS system, and this was a gut punch. The realization came not as a military summary, but as a deep, academic, and therefore even more terrifying insight. The Americans had already built their space-based war machine, and it was not defensive. It was an offensive support network. The entire Soviet military, from its intercontinental missiles to its tank divisions, was based on a terrestrial, analog understanding of the world. They were warriors of the map and compass. The Americans had become warriors of the map and the satellite. The NII-4 report detailed for the first time how the global positioning system was not just a convenient navigator. It was a force multiplier of almost mythical power. It was this unthinkable technology that had allowed 7th Corps to execute its legendary left hook through a howling sandstorm. It was this unthinkable technology that allowed American artillery to strike with pinpoint accuracy, fire a single salvo, and disappear before Soviet counter-battery radars could even get a fix on their position. It was this unthinkable technology that enabled the ancient B-52, a half-century-old aircraft, to drop unguided bombs with the accuracy of guided missiles, simply by knowing its own position in space to the meter at the moment of release. A chill ran down the marshal's spines. An entire decade and billions of rubles had been thrown at combating a phantom space shield, while the Americans had quietly deployed a system that rendered their entire mighty land army a relic. The second revelation of the report was the identification of the all-seeing eye. Analysts had correlated flight data, radio intercepts, and satellite imagery. They singled out the E-8 joint stars and finally understood what it was. Not just a radar plane, it was a battle management platform, the conductor of the orchestra. The very concept was alien to Soviet doctrine. In the Red Army, the man on the battlefield fought, and the general in the bunker commanded, based on reports that were hours, if not days, old. The Americans, as the report concluded with brutal clarity, had merged the general and the soldier. It was this invisible link, this web of data, that united the general and the soldier. In the skies, its own conductor reigned, the J-stars. It didn't just observe the battlefield, it managed it in real time. The report identified this as the key secret of the Highway of Tears. What Western media portrayed as a chaotic slaughter was, in fact, a methodical, almost surgical deconstruction of the Sarkhan army. The J-stars operators were the maestros, and their deadly orchestra consisted of F-15E fighters, A-10 attack aircraft, and Apache helicopters. The J-stars system identified the most valuable targets, T-72 tanks, air defense batteries, and, as if pointing to a score, assigned them to the nearest available musician. It was this system of systems that finally broke the Soviet analysts. The issue wasn't the elusive F-117. It wasn't the deadly Apache. It wasn't even the omnipresent GPS. It was the network, the digital threads that tied them all together. A Soviet MiG-29 pilot was a lone wolf, guided from the ground by a human controller as fallible as himself. An American F-15 pilot was not just a pilot. He was a node in a living neural network. He was connected to an AWACS, which was connected to a J-stars, which was connected to GPS satellites. The American pilot possessed a god's omniscience. The Soviet pilot flew blind, in the deafening silence of the airwaves. The shock of this realization was absolute. The investigation had uncovered a chilling truth. The Red Army was a colossus, a giant of steel and muscle, but it was a blind and deaf one. It was a decentralized, uncoordinated beast whose right hand did not know what its left was doing. The American military, by contrast, was a smaller but far more agile organism, and it possessed a single, brilliant, and lightning-fast central nervous system. Desperate attempts to respond began even before the ink was dry on the report. Countermeasure 1, the ghost hunt. The invisible F-117 threw the Soviet Air Defense Command into a panic. For decades, they had built the densest, most layered, and complex air defense system in the world. It was designed to shoot down high-flying, fast-moving bombers like the B-52 and B-1. But the F-117 proved that neither speed nor altitude mattered anymore. Only signature mattered. In a desperate crash program, Soviet engineers began dusting off old technical manuals. They remembered that their ancient long-wave radars, the P-12 and P-18, could theoretically see an F-117. These low-frequency giants were not accurate enough to guide a missile, but they could detect a blurry blob in the sky where modern radars saw nothing. Out of sheer desperation, a new doctrine was born. The P-18 would detect the blob, transmit its approximate coordinates over the network to an S-200 missile battery, and the battery would launch a missile into the designated grid square in the blind hope of a hit. It was a shot in the dark, a clumsy, slow, and desperately unreliable system. While the Soviets were trying to catch a ghost with a fishing net, the Americans were already designing a poltergeist, the F-22 Raptor. Countermeasure 2, the Apache Killer. The panic induced by the AH-64 Apache and its Hellfire missiles sent tank design bureaus into a frenzy. The T-72, the backbone of the Army, had been exposed as a death trap. Its main vulnerability, the carousel-style autoloader that stored ammunition directly in the fighting compartment, turned the tank into a powder keg. Any penetrating hit, especially from above, caused an instantaneous detonation, vaporizing the crew. The solution came in the form of emergency patches. Engineers rushed to perfect Contact 5, a new generation of explosive reactive armor. These were bricks of explosive bolted to the armor, designed to detonate toward an incoming projectile to disrupt its shaped charge jet. It was a bandage on a severed artery. It made the tank heavier and slower, and it did nothing to solve the root problem. The Apache could still see the T-72 from 8 kilometers away, while the T-72 crew saw nothing. The Soviet answer was to add more armor. The American answer was to create a weapon that ignored it. Countermeasure 3. Blinding the God. The most futile effort was the attempt to challenge the god of location, GPS. The GRU understood perfectly well that global positioning was the linchpin of the entire American war machine. They tasked their electronic warfare units with developing powerful, truck-mounted jammers on a crash timeline. They were going to jam the signal from the heavens. Diesel generators roared to life, powering massive jammers mounted on trucks. Systems like the Smelchok and R330 rushed into production were meant to erect a wall of white noise on GPS frequencies to blind American receivers. It was a complete, resounding failure. They had missed the entire point of the design. The Americans, anticipating such a move, had designed their system with multiple layers of redundancy from the start. The GPS signal was broadcast on 2 codes, a public civilian one and an encrypted jam-resistant military one. But that wasn't all. American tanks and planes didn't rely solely on satellites. They were guided by an inertial navigation system, a complex array of gyroscopes and accelerometers that knew the vehicle's precise position based on its own movement. The GPS signal was just a fine thread used to check the course. Every few seconds, it made microscopic corrections to the inertial system's readings. Even if the Soviets, at an immense cost in energy, managed to jam the sky for a few minutes, an American tank would still know its location with an accuracy unthinkable for the crew of a Soviet T-72. Who at that very moment would be hopelessly lost, staring at a paper map in the middle of a vast desert. The investigation was over. The truth, ugly and brutal, lay on the table. Every countermeasure was too little, too late. The Eurasian Federation had fielded an army prepared to fight World War II all over again. The Americans had built an army for the wars of the 21st century. The Highway of Tears was not a battle. It was an autopsy, the public execution of a failed philosophy. But the cruelest judges are the numbers. They deliver the final cold verdict with the unerring arithmetic of war. The devastating statistics of Operation Desert Storm are not a single figure, but a cascade, each more unbelievable than the last. The first is 100. The ground war, the great meat grinder that the Soviets had assured their Sarkhan clients would drag on for weeks, if not months, was over in 100 hours. An army of over 500,000 men with thousands of tanks was routed, encircled, or utterly destroyed in just 4 days. Next is the ratio of losses in the sky. American F-15 Eagles, many of them built in the 1970s, ruled the air with absolute impunity. They shot down 38 Sarkhan aircraft in air-to-air combat. Over the entire campaign, not a single F-15 was lost to enemy fighters. The pilots of the elite Soviet-trained Sarkhan Air Force flying the best MiG-29s and MiG-25s Krasnograd had to offer, were not just defeated, they were hunted. And finally, the armor. The final numbers are still debated, but the overall picture is staggering. Nearly 4,000 Sarkhan tanks, the vast majority of them Soviet models like the T-72, T-62, and T-55, were confirmed destroyed or captured. In response, the U.S. 7th Corps lost a total of 36 M1A1 Abrams tanks. But even this figure conceals the true, horrifying disparity. Of those 36 lost American tanks, not one was destroyed by the main gun of a Sarkhan tank. The few Abrams tanks that were knocked out were victims of friendly fire or were scuttled by their own crews after being damaged by mines. The Soviet T-72, the symbol of Red Army might, the battering ram of brute force that was supposed to reach the Sterling River in 72 hours, proved to be nothing more than a $4 million coffin on tracks. Its armor was incapable of stopping an American depleted uranium penetrator. Its gun was incapable of piercing the Chobham composite armor of the M1 Abrams. Its fire control system, lacking the Abrams's thermal imagers and laser rangefinders, was blind. The verdict was in. The Soviet war machine was a paper tiger. This rout was not a failure of courage or even numbers. It was a collapse of philosophy. The final, fatal symptom of a deep systemic disease that had afflicted the Soviet economy. The Soviet system was built on imitation. The American system was built on innovation. Throughout the Cold War, the GRU and KGB had been stunningly successful at stealing American technology. The Americans built the B-29 superfortress. The Soviets stole one, and, reverse engineering it down to the last rivet, created the Tu-4. The Americans built the atomic bomb. Soviet spies stole its blueprints. The Soviet military-industrial complex was a giant, powerful, and incredibly effective Xerox machine. But in 1991, a terrible lesson arrived. You cannot steal a network. You cannot copy a philosophy. That it had pulverized the Sarkhan army was forged not of steel, but of silicon. Its true power lay not in the bombs, but in the microprocessors that guided them. The magic of J-stars was not in its radar antenna, but in the complex software and high-speed processors that filtered the signal from the noise. The phenomenal accuracy of the M1 Abrams tank was born not in the barrel of its gun, but in the digital heart of its ballistic computer. And this was a war the Eurasian Federation had lost before it even began, lost irrevocably. While the American military was absorbing the explosive, chaotic, and creative energy of the technological revolution, the Eurasian Federation was sinking in the mire of central planning and a vertically integrated technological swamp. Their desperate attempt to clone the IBM 360 mainframe in the 70s produced the, quote, 103 series, a buggy, unreliable, and obsolete copy at the moment of its birth. In the race for microprocessors, they lagged a full decade behind the Atlantic Alliance, perhaps forever. They could not mass-produce high-speed microchips. They did not know how to write complex, iterative software. Their entire command structure was held together by analog radios and teletypes. While the Americans exchanged digital data packets at the speed of light, the Soviet marshals, with all their theories of deep battle and operational art, remained analog warriors in a digital world. They had created the largest, heaviest, and most expensive analog computer in human history, their army. And there was what happened when you plugged that machine into a digital network. It was a battle of the abacus against the supercomputer. The final report that landed on Marshal Yazov's desk in the summer of 1991 was not just an analysis of a military campaign. It was a death sentence for the entire Soviet experiment. The ruthless numbers left no doubt. A system that suppresses innovation, is terrified of decentralization, and prizes blind copying over inventive genius, is not competitive. Incalculable wealth, a quarter of the gross domestic product, had been thrown into the furnace of a lie. With that money, they had built a phantom army, formidable on parade in Victory Square, but technologically hollow. The Highway of Tears was a mystery that provided its own answer. An epilogue to the Cold War, written in fire and steel. The great shock the Soviets had so feared, a sudden first strike by the Atlantic Alliance, had finally come. But it was not the roar of B-52 squadrons or the fiery trails of Minuteman missiles. It was a signal, a quiet digital pulse, broadcast from a constellation of satellites. A pulse that said, "You are here, the enemy is there, and you are already too late." The mystery of the Highway of Tears lay in a simple, terrifying revelation. The Cold War was never a contest of tanks, missiles, or ideologies. It was a war of information. And the Eurasian Federation, a closed society built on secrecy, paranoia, and the suppression of data, was doomed from the start. The Iron Curtain didn't fall because of grand speeches or street protests. It was simply made obsolete by the network. It pierced it, rendered it transparent, turned it into an anachronism, and then, like static on a radar screen, wiped it away without a trace.